The champagne tower glittered under the crystal chandeliers of the Grandview Estate ballroom, each glass perfectly positioned to catch the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood near the edge of the reception area, adjusting my bow tie for what felt like the 100th time, trying to calm the nervous energy coursing through my veins. Today was supposed to be perfect. Today, I was marrying the woman who had put my broken pieces back together, who had shown me that love didn't have to hurt, that happiness wasn't just something other people got to experience. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered a warning I couldn't quite silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Daniel Reed, and 6 months ago, I never imagined I'd be standing in a place like this, preparing to marry someone as incredible as Sarah. The Grandview Estate wasn't just expensive, it was the kind of venue that showed up in luxury wedding magazines, the kind of place where CEOs and celebrities held their ceremonies. The ballroom alone could hold 300 guests, with its vaulted ceilings painted with classical frescoes and marble columns that looked like they'd been imported from some European palace. Everything about this place screamed elegance and sophistication, from the hand-carved mahogany doors to the Italian marble floors that reflected everything like a mirror. Sarah had wanted something special for our wedding day, and I would have given her anything she asked for. After everything she'd been through, after all the pain her ex-husband had caused her, she deserved a day that felt like a fairy tale. I'd worked double shifts at the construction company for months to help pay for this venue, and her parents had contributed what they could, though they'd made it clear they thought we were spending too much. But Sarah's smile when she first saw this place had made every extra hour worth it. The guest list was modest by Grandview standards, only about 150 people, but everyone who mattered to us would be there. My family had driven in from 3 states away, my mother crying happy tears the moment she met Sarah for the first time. Sarah's parents were still getting used to the idea of her remarrying so soon after her divorce, but they'd warmed up to me once they saw how happy their daughter was. Her friends from the hospital where she worked as a nurse had become like family to me over the past year, and my buddies from the construction crew were probably already sampling the open bar despite the ceremony not starting for another hour. I walked through the reception hall, checking details that the wedding planner had already checked a dozen times. The table arrangements were perfect, each one decorated with white roses and gold accents that matched Sarah's vision exactly. The DJ was setting up his equipment in the corner, testing sound levels and organizing his playlist. The catering staff moved efficiently through the space, preparing the elaborate dinner service that would follow the ceremony. Everything was falling into place exactly as it should. But I couldn't shake this feeling of unease that had settled in my chest since this morning. Sarah had been unusually quiet during breakfast, her normally bright eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite identify. When I'd asked her about it, she'd smiled and kissed my cheek, assuring me it was just normal wedding day nerves. But I knew her well enough by now to recognize when something was truly bothering her. We'd spent the last year learning to read each other's moods, to communicate openly about our fears and insecurities. It was one of the things that made our relationship so different from her previous marriage. Sarah had been married before, to a man named Marcus Thornton, and from what little she'd told me about that relationship, it had been a nightmare. Marcus was a corporate lawyer, the kind of man who wore success like armor and wielded his intelligence like a weapon. He'd made Sarah feel small, inadequate, like she could never measure up to his standards or exist in his world of high-powered clients and 7-figure deals. Their divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, and Sarah had been adamant that she never wanted to see or speak to him again. The thing that had hurt her most, the wound that had cut the deepest, was the way Marcus had mocked her passion for music. Sarah had studied piano seriously throughout her childhood and teenage years, even considering a career as a concert pianist before practical concerns pushed her toward nursing school. She'd kept playing throughout their marriage, finding solace in music when everything else felt like it was falling apart. But Marcus had never understood it, had never appreciated the hours she spent practicing or the emotion she poured into every piece she played. He'd called it a waste of time, a childish hobby that had no place in their adult life together. When they divorced, one of the things Marcus had said during their final argument had stayed with Sarah like a scar. He'd told her that her piano playing was mediocre at best, that she'd never had real talent, that she'd been deluding herself for years thinking she was any good. It was a cruel thing to say, designed specifically to hurt her in the place she was most vulnerable. And it had worked. Sarah hadn't touched a piano in the 8 months since their divorce was finalized. She'd closed that part of herself off completely, like a door she didn't have the strength to open again. Meeting Sarah had changed my life in ways I was still trying to understand. I'd been coming off a rough year myself, having lost my father to cancer and struggled to keep the family construction business afloat while dealing with my grief. I'd met her at a community center where I was volunteering to build wheelchair ramps for elderly residents. She'd been there providing free health screenings, and something about her quiet kindness had drawn me in immediately. We'd started talking, then dating, and within 3 months, I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. She told me about Marcus early on, wanting me to understand why she sometimes flinched at raised voices or apologized too much for things that weren't her fault. I'd listened to her stories about emotional manipulation and constant criticism, about a man who had systematically demolished her self-confidence over 5 years of marriage. And I'd made a promise to myself that I would spend the rest of my life showing her what real love looked like, what it meant to be with someone who celebrated her strengths instead of exploiting her weaknesses. The ceremony was set to take place in the estate's garden chapel, a stunning outdoor space surrounded by ancient oak trees and carefully maintained flower beds. The weather had cooperated perfectly, giving us a clear spring day with temperatures in the low 70s and just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. White wooden chairs were arranged in neat rows facing an elegant arbor wrapped in climbing roses and trailing ivy. It looked like something out of a dream, exactly the kind of setting Sarah had described when we first started planning this day. I checked my watch and saw that I had about 40 minutes before I needed to be in position. The wedding party was getting ready in separate suites on opposite ends of the estate. Sarah was with her bridesmaids, probably putting the finishing touches on her makeup and adjusting the vintage lace dress she'd fallen in love with at a boutique in the city. My groomsmen were in our suite, no doubt taking advantage of the complimentary whiskey and making jokes to help ease my nerves. But instead of joining them, I found myself drawn to a smaller room off the main ballroom that the estate manager had pointed out during our initial tour. It was a music room, intimate and beautifully appointed, with a grand piano as its centerpiece. The instrument was a Bosendorfer, one of the finest piano manufacturers in the world, and it sat in the middle of the room like a piece of art. The estate used this room for cocktail hour entertainment, hiring professional pianists to play soft background music while guests mingled. I'd had an idea a few weeks ago, something I'd been planning in secret with Sarah's best friend and maid of honor, Jennifer. I wanted to surprise Sarah with something meaningful, something that acknowledged the part of herself she'd been afraid to reclaim. The estate had agreed to let me arrange for the cocktail hour pianist to take a break after playing the first few pieces, and I'd prepared something special that I hoped would show Sarah how much I believed in her, how much I wanted her to rediscover the joy that music had once brought her. Walking into the music room now, I felt my heart rate pick up. The piano dominated the space, its polished surface reflecting the soft light from the wall sconces. I'd never been particularly musical myself, couldn't carry a tune in a bucket as my mother liked to say, but I understood what music meant to Sarah. I'd seen the way her eyes lit up when we passed street musicians, the way her fingers would tap out rhythms on her thigh when we listened to classical radio in the car. Music was part of who she was, and Marcus Thornton had tried to kill that part of her. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Jennifer entering the room. She was already dressed in her bridesmaid gown, a flowing sage green dress that complemented her dark complexion beautifully. Jennifer had been Sarah's friend since nursing school, and she'd been one of the few people who had stood by Sarah throughout the difficult years of her marriage to Marcus. She knew things about that relationship that Sarah had never told me, details too painful to share even with someone she loved. "Everything set?" Jennifer asked, her voice low even though we were alone in the room. "I think so," I replied, feeling suddenly uncertain about my plan. "You think she'll be okay with this?" "I don't want to push her too hard, not today of all days." Jennifer smiled, the kind of warm, knowing smile that reminded me why Sarah trusted her so completely. Daniel, what you're planning is exactly what she needs. She's been hiding from this part of herself for too long, letting Marcus's poison words keep her from something she loves. Seeing what you've arranged, knowing that you understand how important music is to her, it's going to mean everything. I just want her to be happy, I said, and heard the emotion creeping into my voice. She deserves to feel good about herself, to not carry around all this doubt that he planted in her head. You're nothing like him, Jennifer said firmly, stepping closer and putting her hand on my arm. Marcus spent 5 years tearing her down because it made him feel powerful. You've spent the last year building her back up because you actually love her. There's no comparison. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us looking at the piano. I thought about Sarah's hands, the way her fingers were always so gentle and precise when she was working with her patients at the hospital. Those same hands had once moved across piano keys with grace and passion, creating beauty out of nothing but practice and dedication. I wanted her to have that back, wanted her to reclaim that piece of herself that Marcus had tried to steal. Did you tell the pianist about the plan? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked Jennifer. All set, she confirmed. Margaret will play for about 20 minutes during cocktail hour, then she'll announce that there's a special surprise performance. That's when you'll invite Sarah to play. The whole thing will seem spontaneous to everyone else, but Sarah will understand that you arranged it specifically for her. What if she refuses? The fear had been nagging at me for weeks. What if she's too nervous or too angry that I put her on the spot? Jennifer shook her head. She won't refuse. Not once she understands what you're really saying to her. You're telling her that you see all of her, including the parts she's been afraid to show. You're telling her that her music matters, that her passion matters, that she doesn't have to hide anymore. A sound from the doorway made us both turn. Sarah's mother, Patricia, stood there with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was a petite woman in her 60s, with silver hair styled elegantly and wearing a sophisticated navy dress. Patricia had been cautiously supportive of our relationship, clearly worried that Sarah was rushing into another marriage too quickly after her divorce. But she'd gradually warmed to me, especially after I'd spent a weekend helping her and Sarah's father renovate their kitchen. Is everything all right? Patricia asked, her eyes moving between Jennifer and me with slight concern. Everything's perfect, I assured her, hoping she couldn't hear the nervous energy in my voice. Just making sure all the details are in order. Patricia stepped into the room, her gaze settling on the piano. Something in her expression shifted, becoming softer and more wistful. Sarah used to play beautifully, she said quietly, almost to herself. When she was young, before everything became so complicated, music was her whole world. She would practice for hours, completely lost in whatever piece she was learning. What happened? I asked, even though I already knew parts of the answer. Life happened, Patricia said with a sad smile. Practical concerns, the pressure to choose a stable career, then Marcus. She said his name like it tasted bitter in her mouth. That man convinced her that everything she loved about herself was worthless. By the end of their marriage, I barely recognized my own daughter. Jennifer and I exchanged glances. We'd both seen the transformation in Sarah over the past year, watched her slowly come back to life as she realized that not all relationships were toxic, that she could be loved without conditions or criticism. She's different now, Patricia continued, her eyes meeting mine. You've helped her remember who she was before Marcus got his hooks into her. Her father and I, we're grateful for that, even if we worry that things are moving quickly. I love her, I said simply, because there were no other words that mattered more. I love everything about her, including the parts of herself she's still learning to love again. Patricia nodded slowly, then surprised me by reaching out to squeeze my hand. I know you do. I can see it in the way you look at her, the way you listen when she talks. You're good for her, Daniel. Better than I initially wanted to admit. Thank you, I managed, feeling a lump forming in my throat. Is there anything I should know about? Patricia asked, her gaze returning to the piano. Any surprises I should be prepared for? Before I could answer, Jennifer jumped in smoothly. Just the usual wedding surprises, Mrs. Chen. Nothing to worry about. Patricia looked at us both skeptically but didn't press further. Well, I should get back to Sarah. She was asking about you a few minutes ago, Daniel. I think she just needs to know you're still here, that you haven't gotten cold feet. The thought was absurd. Running away from Sarah was the last thing I would ever consider. Tell her I'm counting the minutes until I can see her walking down that aisle, I said. After Patricia left, Jennifer and I reviewed the plan one more time. Everything was arranged, everyone who needed to know their part had been briefed. Now all I could do was wait and hope that my surprise would give Sarah what she needed, a chance to reclaim her music and prove to herself that Marcus had been wrong about everything. I left the music room and made my way back toward the groomsman's suite, my mind racing with thoughts of how the day would unfold. The ceremony would be traditional but personal, with vows we'd written ourselves and readings from Sarah's favorite poets. The reception would be elegant but warm, focused more on celebration than formality. And during cocktail hour, Sarah would have a chance to show everyone, including herself, that her music was something precious and real. As I walked through the elegant hallways of the Grandview Estate, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd both come. A year ago, I'd been a guy working construction and trying to keep my late father's business alive, with no thoughts of romance or marriage anywhere on my horizon. Sarah had been a woman barely holding herself together, emerging from a divorce that had left her questioning everything she thought she knew about love and partnership. Now here we were, about to promise forever to each other in front of everyone we cared about. It felt surreal and perfect and slightly terrifying all at once. I wanted to give Sarah the world, wanted to make up for every moment of pain her previous marriage had caused. But more than that, I wanted to show her that she was enough exactly as she was, that she didn't need to change or hide or diminish herself to be loved. The groomsman's suite was exactly as chaotic as I'd expected. My best man, Tommy, who I'd known since elementary school, was attempting to fix his crooked bow tie while simultaneously arguing with my younger brother Jake about something sports-related. My cousin Ryan was taking selfies in his tuxedo, probably already posting them to social media. And my friend Carlos from the construction crew was indeed helping himself to the whiskey, though he at least had the good sense to use a proper glass. There he is. Tommy called out when he spotted me. The man of the hour. We were starting to think you'd made a run for it. Not a chance, I said, accepting the glass of whiskey Carlos handed me. Just checking on some last-minute details. Everything good? Jake asked, his tone more serious than his usual joking demeanor. My brother knew how much this day meant to me, how much Sarah meant to me. Everything's perfect, I assured him, and realized I actually believed it. Yes, I was nervous. Yes, there was a small part of me that worried something would go wrong. But the important thing, the only thing that really mattered, was that in less than an hour, I'd be married to the most incredible woman I'd ever met. The next 40 minutes passed in a blur of final preparations, nervous jokes, and the kind of masculine bonding that happens when men are trying to support each other without getting too emotional about it. Tommy made sure everyone's bow ties were straight and their boutonnieres properly pinned. Carlos shared a surprisingly touching toast about finding real love and not settling for anything less. Jake told embarrassing stories from our childhood that had everyone laughing. And through it all, I kept thinking about Sarah. I pictured her in her suite with Jennifer and the other bridesmaids, probably calmer than I was because she always handled pressure better than I did. I thought about how she looked when she was truly happy, the way her whole face lit up and her eyes crinkled at the corners. I thought about lazy Sunday mornings cooking breakfast together, about late-night conversations where we shared our deepest fears, about the way she fit perfectly against my chest when we danced in our living room to songs only we could hear. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. The wedding coordinator, a efficient woman named Margaret who ran the Grandview Estate's events with military precision, stuck her head in. Gentlemen, it's time. The ceremony begins in 15 minutes. The walk from the suite to the garden chapel felt both endless and far too short. My groomsmen flanked me on either side, a show of support that I appreciated more than I could express. The spring air was perfect, warm without being hot, fragrant with the scent of the roses that climbed the chapel arbor. Guests were already seated, their faces turning toward us as we took our positions at the front. I stood under the arbor with Tommy beside me, looking out at the assembled crowd. I saw my mother in the front row, already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue even though nothing had happened yet. Sarah's parents sat across the aisle, Patricia looking elegant and emotional, Sarah's father stoic but with a slight smile that suggested he approved of this match more than he'd initially let on. Friends and family filled every row, all of them here to witness this moment we'd been planning for months. The string quartet began playing, the processional music flowing through the garden like water. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle one by one, each of them beautiful in their sage green dresses. Jennifer came last, catching my eye and giving me a small, encouraging nod that steadied my nerves. Then the music changed, shifting to the wedding march, and everyone stood. I looked toward the end of the aisle and saw Sarah appear with her father, and the world seemed to stop moving. She was absolutely breathtaking. The vintage lace dress hugged her figure perfectly, its off-shoulder design and flowing train creating a silhouette that looked both timeless and modern. Her dark hair was swept up elegantly, with small white flowers woven through it. But it was her face that made my breath catch, the way she was looking at me with such pure joy and love that I felt it in my chest like a physical force. Sarah and her father began walking down the aisle, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. This was real. This was happening. This incredible woman, who had been through so much pain and still managed to keep her heart open, was choosing to spend her life with me. The ceremony itself passed in a beautiful blur. I remember the officiant's words about love and commitment, remember saying my vows with a voice that shook slightly with emotion, remember sliding the ring onto Sarah's finger and seeing tears slip down her cheeks. When the officiant finally said those magical words about being husband and wife, when I was told I could kiss my bride, I pulled Sarah close and kissed her with all the love and promise I could pour into that single moment. The guests erupted in applause and cheers. We walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, and I felt like I was floating. Sarah was laughing and crying at the same time, squeezing my hand so tightly I thought she might never let go. And I hoped she never would. The cocktail hour was held in the main ballroom while the garden chapel was transformed for the reception dinner. Guests mingled and laughed, sampling the elaborate appetizers the catering staff circulated on silver trays. The champagne tower I'd admired earlier was now flowing, with guests helping themselves to glasses of expensive bubbly. Everything was elegant and perfect, exactly what we'd envisioned. Sarah and I made our rounds, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. My mother hugged Sarah so tightly I thought she might never let go, telling her over and over how happy she was to officially have her as a daughter-in-law. Sarah's nursing school friends clustered around us, all of them talking at once about how beautiful the ceremony had been and how perfect we were together. But as the cocktail hour progressed, I found myself watching the doorway to the music room, waiting for the moment when Margaret the pianist would finish her opening set. Sarah hadn't noticed the piano yet, too busy chatting with guests and basking in the joy of the day. But soon, very soon, she would have a chance to reconnect with the part of herself she'd been missing. The sounds of piano music drifted through the ballroom, sophisticated jazz standards and classical pieces that provided the perfect backdrop for conversation and celebration. Margaret was talented, her playing smooth and professional, exactly what you'd expect from someone hired to perform at high-end wedding receptions. I was in the middle of talking to my Uncle Frank about potentially expanding the construction business when I noticed a commotion near the main entrance to the ballroom. Several guests had turned to look at something, their expressions confused and slightly alarmed. Sarah, who had been laughing at something Jennifer said, suddenly went completely pale, her champagne glass nearly slipping from her hand. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. Marcus Thornton stood in the doorway like he owned the place, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck. He was tall and conventionally handsome, with perfectly styled dark hair and the kind of confident posture that came from a lifetime of privilege and success. His expression was cold and calculating, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sarah. And then he smiled, but there was nothing warm or friendly about it. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. Everything was about to change, and not in any way I could have anticipated. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment Marcus Thornton crossed the threshold. I watched as conversations faltered and died around us, guests sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere without quite understanding what had caused it. Sarah's hand had gone ice cold in mine, and when I looked at her face, I saw something I'd never witnessed before, raw terror mixed with a fury so intense it made her whole body tremble. Jennifer was the first to react, stepping forward with her jaw set in a way that would have been intimidating to anyone who didn't know her. But she knew Marcus, had watched him systematically destroy Sarah's confidence over 5 years of marriage, and the look on her face suggested she was more than ready for a confrontation. "You need to leave," Jennifer said, her voice cutting through the awkward silence that had fallen over our section of the ballroom. "You weren't invited, and you have no business being here." Marcus's smile widened, and I felt my hands curling into fists at my sides. He looked completely unbothered by Jennifer's hostility, like her words were nothing more than background noise he could easily ignore. His eyes were still locked on Sarah, studying her with the kind of clinical detachment a scientist might use when examining an insect under a microscope. "I heard through the grapevine that my ex-wife was getting married," Marcus said, his voice smooth and educated, the kind of voice that had probably won him cases in courtrooms across the state. "I thought it would be rude not to stop by and offer my congratulations. After all, we were married for 5 years. That kind of history deserves at least a courtesy visit, don't you think?" Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out shakier than I'd ever heard it. "Get out, Marcus. You have no right to be here." "Actually, I have every right to be wherever I choose to be," Marcus replied, his tone turning slightly condescending. "This is a public venue, and I happen to be friendly with the estate manager." He was more than happy to let me join the celebration when I explained my connection to the bride. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and dangerous. The estate manager had let him in? After all the careful planning, after all the security measures we'd supposedly put in place to ensure this day went smoothly, Marcus had simply talked his way past everything because he had connections and charm and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "You need to leave right now," I said, stepping forward so I was positioned slightly in front of Sarah. It was a protective instinct I couldn't control, this need to put myself between her and the man who had caused her so much pain. "This is our wedding day, and you're not welcome here." Marcus's attention shifted to me for the first time, and I felt the full weight of his assessment. He looked me up and down slowly, taking in my rented tuxedo in my construction worker's hands and probably calculating exactly how much money I made in a year compared to his salary. When his eyes met mine again, there was open contempt in them. "So you're the new husband," Marcus said, managing to make it sound like an insult. Sarah always did have a type. "Tell me, does she still do that thing where she apologizes constantly for things that aren't her fault? It's exhausting, isn't it? 5 years of that nearly drove me insane." "Don't talk about her like that," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Tommy had moved up beside me now, along with Jake and Carlos, my groomsmen forming a protective barrier. But Marcus didn't seem intimidated at all. If anything, he looked amused. "I'm simply making conversation," Marcus said with a shrug. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about what drew you to Sarah. Was it her sparkling personality? Her impressive career as a nurse? Or perhaps, and here his smile turned cruel, it was her mediocre piano playing that won your heart?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. I felt her flinch beside me, heard her sharp intake of breath. This was the wound Marcus knew exactly how to reopen, the insecurity he had planted deep in her psyche and watered with years of criticism and contempt. "Her piano playing is beautiful," I said firmly, even though I'd never actually heard her play. "Everything about Sarah is beautiful, which is something you were apparently too blind and too cruel to recognize." "Beautiful?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Is that what she told you? That she used to be some kind of musical prodigy? Let me guess, she showed you some participation certificates from childhood recitals and convinced you she had real talent?" More guests were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. I could see confusion on many faces, people trying to understand who this well-dressed stranger was and why he was causing such obvious distress at what should have been a joyous celebration. Sarah's parents had pushed their way through the crowd, Patricia's face white with shock and anger. "Marcus, you son of a," Patricia started, but her husband put a restraining hand on her arm. "Not here, Patty," he murmured. "Don't let him ruin this day any more than he already has." But Marcus wasn't done. He'd come here with a purpose, and I was beginning to realize that simply crashing the wedding wasn't enough for him. He wanted to hurt Sarah, wanted to remind her of every insecurity he'd spent their marriage cultivating. And he was going to do it in front of everyone we cared about. "I heard there's going to be piano music during the reception," Marcus continued, his eyes sliding past me to focus on Sarah again. "Margaret Foster is playing, isn't she? Excellent pianist, truly talented. We used the same performer at several of my firm's events. The difference between a professional and an amateur is really quite stark when you hear them back to back." "What are you doing here, Marcus?" Sarah asked, and I hated the defeated tone in her voice. Just minutes ago, she'd been radiant with happiness, glowing with joy as we celebrated our marriage. Now she sounded small and scared, like a child being scolded for something she couldn't control. "I told you, I came to offer my congratulations," Marcus said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "But I also thought it might be educational for your new husband to understand what he's gotten himself into. You see, Daniel, during our marriage, Sarah was absolutely convinced that she had musical talent. She would spend hours at the piano, practicing pieces that were frankly beyond her skill level, making the same mistakes over and over again." "Shut your mouth," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," Marcus countered smoothly. "I sat through countless dinner parties where Sarah insisted on entertaining our guests with her playing. The looks on people's faces, the barely concealed winces when she hit wrong notes, the polite applause that was really just relief that the performance was over. It was embarrassing, honestly. I tried to be supportive, tried to gently suggest that perhaps piano wasn't her calling, but she refused to accept reality. Every word was calculated, designed to inflict maximum damage. I could see what he was doing, could recognize the manipulation tactics even if I'd never experienced them firsthand. He was rewriting history, painting himself as the patient, long-suffering husband who had tried to help Sarah see the truth about her limitations. It was gaslighting at its finest, and I wanted nothing more than to physically remove him from our reception. "That's not how it happened," Sarah said, but her voice was weak, uncertain. Marcus had done such a thorough job of destroying her confidence during their marriage that even now, even surrounded by people who loved her, she was struggling to defend herself against his lies. "Isn't it?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Do you remember the Hendersons' anniversary party? You played that Chopin piece you'd been working on for months, and afterwards, Mrs. Henderson pulled me aside to ask if perhaps you'd been drinking because surely no sober person would perform so poorly in public. Or what about the firm's holiday party, when you insisted on playing carols and 3 people left the room because they couldn't stand to listen anymore? I didn't know if these stories were true or fabricated, but it didn't matter. The damage was being done with every word, every specific detail that made his cruelty sound like concerned observation." Sarah's face had gone from pale to flushed, tears starting to well up in her eyes despite her obvious efforts to hold them back. "You're lying," I said, my voice steady even though everything inside me was screaming. "You spent 5 years tearing her down because it made you feel powerful. Everything you're saying right now is just more of the same poison you fed her throughout your marriage." Marcus turned his attention back to me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Respect? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. "You're very protective of her," he observed. "That's sweet, really. But protection doesn't change facts." Sarah convinced herself she had musical talent because she couldn't accept that she was ordinary. There's no shame in being ordinary, of course, but she always wanted to be special. "She is special," I said firmly. "She's the most talented, caring, incredible person I've ever met, and the fact that you spent 5 years trying to convince her otherwise says everything about you and nothing about her. Does she still have that old keyboard? Marcus asked suddenly, ignoring my words entirely. The one she bought when we first got married? She used to practice on it for hours, with headphones on so I wouldn't have to hear her mistakes. I always thought that was rather symbolic, don't you think? Even she knew her playing wasn't something anyone would want to listen to. The headphones detail hit me hard because Sarah had mentioned it. Once, late at night when we were talking about her marriage. She'd described practicing with headphones because Marcus complained about the noise, but she'd framed it as being considerate of his work schedule. Now I understood it had been another form of control, another way Marcus had isolated her from her passion and made her feel like she had to hide a fundamental part of herself. You're a pathetic excuse for a man, Tommy said, stepping forward. He'd been my best friend for 20 years, and I'd told him everything about Sarah's previous marriage. You're so insecure and inadequate that the only way you can feel good about yourself is by making other people feel bad. That's not strength. That's weakness. Marcus's smile finally faltered, just for a moment, but he recovered quickly. I don't expect construction workers to understand the complexities of a relationship between two professionals, he said dismissively. Sarah and I existed in a world that required certain standards, certain levels of excellence. She simply couldn't maintain those standards, in music or in many other areas of our life together. The implication was clear and disgusting. Sarah made a small sound of distress, and I saw Patricia move toward her daughter, but Sarah held up a hand to stop her. Something was changing in her expression, the fear and hurt slowly being replaced by something harder, more determined. You came here to hurt me, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. That's the only reason you're here. You couldn't stand the thought of me being happy with someone else, so you had to show up and try to destroy that happiness. I came here to save your new husband from making a terrible mistake, Marcus corrected. Call it a public service. He deserves to know the truth about who he married, about the delusions she carries and the disappointments that await him. The only mistake anyone made was Sarah wasting 5 years of her life with you, Jennifer said, positioning herself next to Sarah in a show of solidarity. Everyone here knows the truth about you, Marcus. You're an abuser who used words instead of fists, and that doesn't make you any less dangerous or any less disgusting. The word abuser seemed to hit Marcus harder than any of the other insults. His expression darkened, the charming mask slipping to reveal the cruel, controlling man underneath. Be careful throwing around accusations like that, he said coldly. My firm has an excellent defamation department. Truth isn't defamation, I said. And everything Jennifer said is absolutely accurate. You spent 5 years systematically destroying Sarah's self-confidence, making her doubt everything good about herself, convincing her that she was lucky you put up with her inadequacies. That's emotional abuse, and the fact that you're here right now, trying to do the same thing at her wedding, proves you haven't changed at all. The crowd around us had grown larger, with more wedding guests abandoning their champagne and appetizers to witness this confrontation. I could see shock on many faces, anger on others, and confusion on those who didn't know the history between Sarah and Marcus. But I also saw something else, recognition from the women in the crowd, especially the ones around Sarah's age. They knew what emotional abuse looked like because they'd either experienced it themselves or watched friends go through it. I think we've established that I'm not welcome here, Marcus said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false surrender. Though I have to say, before I go, I'm disappointed I won't get to hear Sarah play. I was hoping she might have improved over the past 8 months, though I suppose some things never change. Mediocrity is mediocrity, no matter how much time passes. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I watched Sarah's face crumble. This was what Marcus had come here to do, this final cruel blow designed to ensure she would never touch a piano again, never reclaim the part of herself he had worked so hard to destroy. And I realized with sickening clarity that if I didn't do something right now, he would succeed. My surprise plan for the cocktail hour suddenly took on new meaning. What had been meant as a gentle encouragement for Sarah to rediscover her love of music had become something far more critical, a chance for her to reclaim her power and prove Marcus wrong in front of everyone who mattered. Actually, I heard myself saying, my voice carrying across the ballroom with a confidence I didn't quite feel. Sarah is going to play for us today. I arranged it as a surprise, but given the circumstances, I think now is the perfect time. Sarah's head whipped toward me, her eyes wide with panic. Daniel, no. I can't. I haven't played in months. You're not what? I interrupted gently, moving to stand directly in front of her so she had to look at me instead of Marcus. You're not talented. You're not good enough. Those are his words, Sarah. His lies. Not the truth. But what if he's right? Sarah whispered, and the vulnerability in her voice broke my heart. What if I'm really not any good? What if I embarrass myself in front of everyone? Then you embarrass yourself, I said, taking both of her hands in mine. But I don't believe that's what's going to happen. I believe you're going to walk into that music room, sit down at that piano, and remind everyone here, including yourself, why you fell in love with music in the first place. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and contemptuous. Oh, this is perfect. Please, by all means, let's have a performance. I wouldn't miss this for the world. It'll be just like old times, watching Sarah fumble through a piece she hasn't adequately practiced, seeing the pity on people's faces as they realize they're trapped listening to subpar playing. Nobody asked for your opinion, Jake said, stepping between Marcus and me. And nobody wants you here to witness anything. You've said your piece, now get the hell out. I'm staying, Marcus said flatly. If Sarah is brave enough to perform, I'm courteous enough to listen. Consider it a wedding gift, my professional assessment of whether she's made any progress since our divorce. The whole situation had spiraled so far beyond what I'd planned that I felt like I was drowning. This was supposed to be Sarah's special day, a celebration of our love and our future together. Instead, it had turned into a referendum on her worth as a musician and a person, with her abusive ex-husband as the judge and jury. But as I looked at Sarah's face, I saw something shifting in her expression. The fear was still there, but it was being joined by something else, a spark of defiance that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with. The woman who had survived 5 years with Marcus and come out the other side. The woman who had found the courage to love again despite all the damage he'd caused. I'll do it, Sarah said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. I'll play. Sarah, you don't have to, Patricia said, moving forward to put her arm around her daughter. You don't have to prove anything to this monster. I'm not doing it for him, Sarah said, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. I'm doing it for me. And for Daniel, who believed in me enough to arrange this surprise even though he knew I'd be terrified. Jennifer squeezed Sarah's shoulder, tears in her eyes. You've got this, honey. Show them what you're really made of. The crowd began to part, creating a path toward the music room where Margaret had been playing background jazz for the past 20 minutes. Someone must have alerted her to the situation because the piano music had stopped, leaving an expectant silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She was still pale, still visibly shaking, but there was a determination in her posture that hadn't been there a few moments ago. She looked at Marcus one last time, and I saw something pass between them, a final acknowledgement of everything he'd done to her and everything she was about to prove him wrong about. Let's go, she said to me, taking my hand and holding it tight. We walked through the crowd together, my wife and I, heading toward a moment that would define not just our wedding day but possibly the rest of our lives together. Behind us, I could hear footsteps as guests followed, drawn by curiosity and concern and the undeniable drama of the situation. And I knew that somewhere in that crowd, Marcus Thornton was following too, confident that he was about to witness Sarah's humiliation and cement his narrative about her inadequacy. The music room looked exactly as it had earlier, intimate and elegant with the Bosendorfer grand piano dominating the space. Margaret stood near the piano, her expression concerned as she took in Sarah's obvious distress. Jennifer had rushed ahead and was whispering something to Margaret, probably explaining the situation and confirming that Sarah was going to play. The room filled quickly, guests crowding in until every available space was occupied. More people stood in the doorway and spilled out into the hallway, creating an audience far larger than I'd ever anticipated. What was supposed to be a small, intimate surprise had become a public spectacle, and I felt guilt crushing down on me. This was my fault. If I hadn't announced that Sarah was going to play, she wouldn't be in this position. But Sarah didn't seem to be focused on the crowd. Her attention was fixed entirely on the piano, and as we approached it, I saw her reach out with one trembling hand to touch the polished wood. It was a gesture so tender and reverent that it made my throat tight with emotion. "It's a Bosendorfer," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "I've never played one before." "Then today you get to experience something new," I said, trying to sound encouraging even though my heart was hammering in my chest. "No pressure, Sarah. You don't have to do this if you don't want to." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw tears sliding down her cheeks. But she was also smiling, a small, shaky smile that held more courage than I'd ever seen in any person. "I want to," she said. "I need to. For 8 months, I've let his words control me, let his judgment silence something I love. If I don't do this now, I might never do it again." Marcus had positioned himself near the front of the crowd, arms crossed over his chest, wearing an expression of smug anticipation. He looked like a man settling in to watch a disaster unfold, secure in his belief that he knew exactly how this would end. Sarah sat down at the piano bench, her wedding dress spreading out around her like a cloud of vintage lace. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, trembling so badly I thought she might not be able to play at all. The silence in the room was absolute, every person holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, her shoulders rising and falling as she tried to center herself. I wanted to say something encouraging, wanted to tell her again that she didn't have to do this, but I sensed that any words from me would only break her concentration. When Sarah opened her eyes again, something had changed. The fear was still present, but it had been joined by a kind of quiet determination that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her. She placed her hands on the keys, finding the proper position with muscle memory that apparently survived 8 months of silence. And then, in the hushed expectation of that elegant music room, with over 100 people watching and her ex-husband waiting to mock her failure, Sarah began to play. The first notes were hesitant, uncertain, her fingers stumbling slightly over the opening phrase. I saw Marcus's smile widen, saw him exchange a knowing look with someone near him, as if to say, "See? I told you so." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and I felt my heart sinking as I realized my beautiful surprise had turned into the exact humiliation Marcus had predicted. But then something extraordinary happened. Sarah's hands found their rhythm, her fingers beginning to move with increasing confidence across the keys. The hesitant notes gave way to something more assured, more fluid. Whatever piece she was playing, I didn't recognize it, but it was starting to sound beautiful, the melody emerging clear and strong from the magnificent Bosendorfer. She'd chosen Debussy's Clair de Lune, I would learn later, a piece she'd spent years perfecting before Marcus had convinced her to stop playing. It was a work that required both technical skill and emotional depth, every phrase needing to be shaped with delicate precision, every dynamic change carefully controlled. It was not an easy piece, not something anyone would choose if they were uncertain of their abilities. But Sarah wasn't uncertain anymore. As she played, I watched the transformation happen right before my eyes. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing became more natural, and her whole body seemed to sink into the music like she was coming home after a long absence. The fear that had been so evident just moments before was melting away, replaced by something that looked almost like joy. The music filled the room, each note pure and perfect, the melody flowing like water over smooth stones. This wasn't mediocre playing or amateur fumbling. This was skilled, passionate, deeply moving music being performed by someone who clearly understood not just the technical requirements of the piece but its emotional heart. I looked around the room and saw the change happening in the audience. The uncomfortable shifting had stopped. People were leaning forward now, drawn into the spell Sarah was weaving with her music. Some had their eyes closed, simply listening. Others were watching her hands move across the keys with expressions of wonder. Marcus's smug smile had vanished completely. His arms were no longer crossed in confident judgment. Instead, he stood frozen, his face gradually shifting from anticipation to confusion to something that might have been shock. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't the narrative he'd constructed about Sarah's inadequate musical abilities. Jennifer was crying, tears streaming down her face as she watched her best friend reclaim something precious that had been stolen from her. Patricia had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with amazement. Sarah's father had his arm around his wife, both of them watching their daughter with expressions of pride and relief. The piece continued to unfold, each section more beautiful than the last. Sarah navigated the challenging middle portions with ease, her hands moving across the keyboard with grace and precision. When she reached the climactic moments, the emotional high points of the composition, she played with such feeling that I saw several people in the audience wiping away tears. This was what Marcus had tried to destroy. This gift, this passion, this incredible ability to communicate emotion through music. He'd spent 5 years telling Sarah she was mediocre, that her playing was an embarrassment, that she should give up on something she loved because she wasn't good enough. And he'd almost succeeded in making her believe it. But now, in this moment, the truth was undeniable. Sarah wasn't mediocre. She was extraordinary. And everyone in this room, including Marcus, was being forced to confront the reality of just how wrong he'd been. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, the gentle, ethereal final phrases floating through the air like mist, I felt tears sliding down my own cheeks. This was more than just a musical performance. This was Sarah's declaration of independence, her refusal to let Marcus's cruelty define her anymore. Every note was an act of defiance, every phrase a reclamation of her own worth. The final chord faded into silence, and for a long moment, nobody moved. The room seemed to be holding its breath, suspended in the beautiful space between the last note and whatever came next. Sarah's hands remained on the keys, her head bowed, her breathing slightly labored from the emotional intensity of what she'd just accomplished. Then someone started clapping. It was Tommy, I realized, my best friend who knew nothing about classical music but understood perfectly what he'd just witnessed. The applause started slow but built quickly, spreading through the room like wildfire until everyone was clapping, not the polite appreciation you might give to background music at a party, but genuine, enthusiastic applause that acknowledged something truly special. People weren't just clapping. They were standing up, one after another, until the entire room was on its feet, giving Sarah a standing ovation that would have been impressive at a professional concert hall, let alone a wedding reception. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, a physical manifestation of how profoundly her playing had moved everyone present. Sarah slowly lifted her head and turned to look at the audience. Her face was wet with tears, her carefully applied wedding makeup smudged and running, but she was smiling with a radiance that took my breath away. This was the woman I'd married, strong and talented and absolutely beautiful, finally seeing herself the way everyone else saw her. I moved to the piano and pulled her up from the bench, wrapping my arms around her as the applause continued. She buried her face in my chest, her whole body shaking with sobs that were equal parts relief and joy and the release of 8 months of pent-up emotion. "You were incredible," I whispered into her hair. "You were absolutely incredible." "I can't believe I did that," she said, her voice muffled against my tuxedo jacket. I was so scared, but once I started playing, it was like everything else disappeared. It was just me and the music, the way it used to be before. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both knew what she meant. Before Marcus. Before the criticism and the mockery and the systematic destruction of her confidence. The applause was finally dying down, but people were crowding forward, wanting to congratulate Sarah, to tell her how beautiful her playing had been. Her nursing school friends surrounded us, all talking at once about how amazing she was and how they'd never known she could play like that. My construction crew guys were slapping me on the back, making jokes about how I'd married way out of my league. But through the crowd, I caught sight of Marcus. He hadn't moved from his spot near the front of the room. While everyone else was celebrating, he stood alone, isolated by his own cruelty and the undeniable evidence that everything he'd said about Sarah was a lie. His face had gone through several expressions during Sarah's performance: shock, confusion, anger, and finally something that might have been shame, though I doubted he was capable of true remorse. Now he just looked empty, like someone had pulled out a crucial support beam and his entire worldview had collapsed. Sarah saw him too. She pulled away from me slightly, wiping her eyes, and turned to face the man who had tormented her for 5 years. The crowd seemed to sense the importance of this moment and gradually fell silent, creating a space for whatever was about to happen. "You were wrong, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "You were wrong about me, wrong about my music, wrong about everything. And I'm done letting your words have any power over me." Marcus opened his mouth, probably to offer some excuse or rationalization, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. "I don't need your apology or your acknowledgement," she continued. "I don't need anything from you anymore. What I needed was to prove to myself that I'm not the person you tried to convince me I was. And I just did that." She turned away from him then, a deliberate dismissal that was more powerful than any angry words could have been. Marcus had become irrelevant, his opinion meaningless, his presence unwanted. And the most beautiful thing about it was that Sarah wasn't being cruel or vindictive. She was simply done with him, finished giving him space in her head and her heart. "I think it's time for you to leave now," Dr. Patricia said, moving to stand beside her daughter. "You came here to hurt Sarah, but all you've done is prove how small and pathetic you really are. Go home, Marcus. We have a wedding to celebrate, and you're not part of this family anymore." For a moment, it looked like Marcus might argue, might try one last time to reassert control over the situation. But as he looked around the room, seeing nothing but contempt and dismissal on the faces watching him, something seemed to deflate in him. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the music room, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floors as he made his humiliating exit. A cheer went up from the crowd as he disappeared, spontaneous and joyful, the sound of people celebrating not just Sarah's incredible performance but her liberation from the man who had tried to destroy her. Jennifer started a chant of Sarah. Sarah, that quickly caught on until the whole room was calling my wife's name like she was a rock star who'd just played the concert of a lifetime. And in a way, she had. Not a concert, exactly, but definitely the performance of a lifetime, one that would be remembered and talked about by everyone present for years to come. The story would be told at family gatherings and passed down through generations. The day Sarah Reed played piano at her own wedding and silenced her abusive ex-husband with nothing more than talent, courage, and a refusal to let his cruelty define her anymore. Sarah was laughing and crying at the same time, accepting hugs and congratulations from what felt like every person in the room. The joy on her face was almost painful to witness, knowing how close she'd come to never experiencing this moment, to letting Marcus's lies keep her from something she loved so deeply. Margaret, the pianist who was supposed to have been playing during cocktail hour, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "That was extraordinary," she said, taking Sarah's hands in her own. "The technique, the emotion, the interpretation, all of it was just wonderful. Have you considered performing professionally?" Sarah shook her head, looking overwhelmed by the compliment. "I'm a nurse. Music is just something I do for myself." "Well, you should do it for others too," Margaret said firmly. "The world needs to hear playing like that. You have a genuine gift." As the celebration continued around us, I pulled Sarah aside to a quieter corner of the music room. She looked exhausted but radiant, like someone who'd just climbed a mountain they'd been told was impossible to summit. "I'm sorry," I said, the guilt I'd been feeling finally spilling out. "This wasn't how I wanted this surprise to go. I never meant for Marcus to show up, never meant to put you in that position." Sarah reached up and cupped my face with both hands, forcing me to look directly at her. "Don't apologize," she said fiercely. "What you did, arranging for me to play, believing in me enough to create that opportunity, it was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Yes, Marcus showing up made it harder and scarier, but it also made it more meaningful. I didn't just play for people who love me. I played in front of the person who convinced me I couldn't, and I proved him wrong. "You were so brave," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "Watching you up there, seeing you reclaim something he tried to take from you, It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. I almost didn't do it, Sarah admitted. When he started talking, when he reminded me of all those times I failed, all those performances that didn't go well, I wanted to run away and hide. But then I looked at you, and I remembered that I'm not that scared, diminished person anymore. Marcus doesn't get to control my story. I do. We stood there holding each other while the party continued around us, guests gradually drifting back toward the main ballroom to continue the reception festivities. But neither of us was ready to leave this room yet, this space where something transformative had just occurred. Jennifer appeared beside us, still dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. I have never been prouder of anyone in my entire life, she said, pulling Sarah into a fierce hug. That was the most badass thing I've ever seen. You absolutely destroyed him, and you did it with nothing but beautiful music. Thank you for always believing in me, Sarah said, her voice muffled against Jennifer's shoulder. Even when I stopped believing in myself. Always, Jennifer promised. That's what best friends do. The reception dinner was delayed by nearly 30 minutes because so many guests wanted to talk to Sarah about her performance, to ask questions about her musical background, to express their amazement at her talent. The story of Marcus's humiliating exit had already spread through the entire venue, becoming part of the wedding's legend before the event had even concluded. When we finally made our way to the main ballroom for dinner, the atmosphere was electric with happiness and celebration. What could have been a disaster, what Marcus had intended to be Sarah's public humiliation, had instead become a triumph that elevated our entire wedding day into something extraordinary. During dinner, guest after guest stood to make toasts that referenced Sarah's performance. My Uncle Frank, who'd never been particularly eloquent, gave a rambling speech about the power of love to heal old wounds. One of Sarah's nursing colleagues talked about how Sarah's courage in facing her fears inspired everyone who knew her. Even the estate manager, who'd felt terrible about inadvertently letting Marcus into the reception, stood up to apologize and praise Sarah's incredible playing. But the most meaningful toast came from Sarah's father, a quiet man who rarely spoke in public. He stood up slowly, his champagne glass trembling slightly in his hand, and looked at his daughter with undisguised emotion. Sarah, he began, his voice thick, your mother and I watched you struggle for 5 years in a marriage that dimmed your light. We felt helpless, knowing you were hurting but not sure how to help. When you finally left Marcus, we were relieved but worried about the scars he'd left on your spirit. Sarah's father cleared his throat, emotion making his voice waver. Today, watching you play that piano, seeing you reclaim what was taken from you, I realized something important. You didn't just survive Marcus. You became stronger because of what you endured. And Daniel, he turned to look at me. Thank you for seeing what we always saw in our daughter. Thank you for loving her the way she deserves to be loved. The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt. Sarah was crying again, but these were purely happy tears now, the kind that come from feeling truly seen and valued by the people who matter most. I squeezed her hand under the table, and she squeezed back, a silent communication that needed no words. As dinner wound down and the dancing began, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Marcus's appearance could have destroyed our wedding day, could have sent Sarah spiraling back into the insecurity and self-doubt he'd worked so hard to cultivate. Instead, it had become the catalyst for one of the most powerful moments of reclamation I'd ever witnessed. Sarah had faced her demon and defeated it not with anger or revenge, but with the simple truth of her own talent and worth. She'd proven that his words were lies, that his judgment was worthless, that she was exactly as gifted and valuable as she'd always been before he convinced her otherwise. Our first dance as husband and wife took on new meaning now. As we swayed together to a song Sarah had chosen months ago, I realized that we were both different people than we'd been that morning. The day's events had stripped away pretense and fear, leaving only the essential truth of who we were together. Partners who lifted each other up, who believed in each other's potential, who refused to let past pain dictate future joy. I love you, Sarah whispered against my chest as we danced. Not just for arranging the piano surprise, but for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I'll always believe in you, I promised. Always. As the evening progressed, something beautiful emerged from the chaos Marcus had tried to create. Sarah's performance became a catalyst for conversation about emotional abuse, about the ways people use criticism to control their partners, about the importance of supporting the people we love rather than diminishing them. Guests who had experienced similar relationships found themselves opening up, sharing their own stories, finding solidarity and understanding. Several of Sarah's nursing colleagues approached her later in the evening with stories about their own creative passions that had been suppressed by critical partners or family members. One woman confessed she'd stopped painting after her ex-boyfriend mocked her artwork. Another admitted she'd given up writing poetry because her husband said it was a waste of time. Sarah's courage in reclaiming her music had given them permission to consider reclaiming their own abandoned passions. Jennifer cornered me near the bar around 10 o'clock, slightly tipsy but radiantly happy. "You know what you did today, right?" she asked, poking my chest with her finger. "You didn't just give Sarah a piano. You gave her back herself." "She did that," I corrected. "I just provided the opportunity." "That's what love is supposed to do," Jennifer said, suddenly serious despite the champagne. "Provide opportunities for the people we care about to become their best selves. Marcus spent 5 years creating obstacles. You spent 1 year removing them. That's the difference." Later, when the party was winding down and guests were starting to leave, Patricia pulled me aside. Her makeup was smudged from crying throughout the evening, but she looked happier than I'd seen her since meeting Sarah's family. "I misjudged you initially," she admitted. "I thought Sarah was rushing into another marriage, repeating old patterns. But tonight, I understood something. You're not Marcus's opposite because you're nice instead of cruel. You're his opposite because you see Sarah's strength where he only saw weakness. That's what she needed. That's what she deserves." "I'm the lucky one," I said honestly. "Sarah is the strongest person I know." "She is now," Patricia agreed. "But she wasn't always. You helped her remember that strength. Don't ever underestimate what a gift that is." As midnight approached and the reception finally ended, Sarah and I stood together in the now empty ballroom, surrounded by the elegant remnants of our celebration. Flower petals littered the dance floor, empty champagne glasses clustered on tables, the faint scent of wedding cake still hanging in the air. "This wasn't the day I planned," Sarah said, leaning against me tiredly. "It was so much better." "Even with Marcus showing up?" I asked. "Especially with Marcus showing up," she corrected. "Because I got to prove something I needed to prove. Not to him, really, but to myself. That his words don't have power over me anymore. That I'm not the broken, inadequate person he tried to convince me I was." We made our way back to the music room one last time before leaving. The Bosendorfer sat silent in the soft lighting, waiting for its next performer. Sarah approached it slowly, reverently, and pressed a single key. The note rang out pure and clear in the empty room. "I'm going to start playing again," she announced, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Really playing, not just occasionally but regularly. Maybe I'll even look into performing at nursing home events or community centers. Nothing professional, just sharing music with people who might need it." "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, wrapping my arms around her from behind as she stood at the piano. "The world deserves to hear you play." "I was thinking," Sarah continued, "maybe we could get a piano for our house. Nothing as fancy as this, but something real that I can practice on without headphones. Something I don't have to hide. Consider it our first major purchase as a married couple," I promised. "We'll find you the perfect instrument." Sarah turned in my arms to face me, her expression soft and content. "Thank you for today. For everything. For the surprise, for standing up to Marcus, for believing I could do something I was terrified to attempt. You gave me back a piece of myself I thought was lost forever." "You were never lost," I said, touching her face gently. "You were just waiting for the right moment to come back to yourself. I'm honored I got to witness it." We left the Grandview Estate that night as different people than we'd arrived. The wedding had been beautiful, the ceremony meaningful, the reception elegant. But what made the day truly unforgettable was watching Sarah reclaim her power, her passion, and her sense of self-worth from a man who had tried to destroy all three. Marcus had crashed our wedding intending to mock and humiliate. Instead, he'd provided the perfect stage for Sarah to demonstrate that his cruelty had no lasting power over her life. His attempt to diminish her had backfired spectacularly, becoming instead the catalyst for her most triumphant moment. In the years that followed, Sarah would indeed start playing piano regularly. She'd perform at nursing homes and hospitals, bringing music to people who needed beauty in their lives. She'd teach piano lessons to children whose families couldn't afford expensive instructors, passing on the gift that had sustained her through her darkest times. And she'd never again let anyone convince her that her passion was worthless or her talent was insufficient. As for Marcus, we heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd left the wedding reception and driven straight home, where he'd apparently spent the rest of the evening alone with a very expensive bottle of scotch. He never contacted Sarah again, never attempted to justify his behavior or apologize for his cruelty. He simply disappeared from her life as completely as if he'd never existed. And that, ultimately, was the greatest gift. Not his absence itself, but Sarah's complete indifference to whether he was present or absent, sorry or unrepentant, changed or unchanged. He had become irrelevant, a footnote in her history rather than the defining chapter he tried to make himself. Our wedding day became legendary in our circle of friends and family. People still talk about it years later, about Sarah's courage and grace, about Marcus's humiliating defeat, about the power of love to heal old wounds and create space for people to rediscover their truest selves. But for me, the most important part wasn't the drama or the triumph. It was the moment when Sarah's hands first touched those piano keys and I saw her face transform. In that instant, I witnessed the woman I loved remembering who she really was, not the diminished version Marcus had tried to create, but the brilliant, talented, passionate person she'd always been. That was the real wedding gift we gave each other that day. Not rings or vows or promises, though those mattered too. But the commitment to help each other become the best versions of ourselves, to lift each other up rather than tear each other down, to celebrate each other's gifts rather than fear them. Marcus had tried to write Sarah's story as a tragedy. But standing together in that music room, surrounded by the echoes of her beautiful performance, we rewrote the ending. Not as a tragedy, but as a love story. The kind where courage wins, where truth prevails, and where people who've been broken find ways to become whole again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.